Papyrus Berlinensis 8502 sits inside Berlin's Ägyptisches Museum, catalogued, climate-controlled, and restricted to credentialed researchers. The manuscript measures roughly 22 centimeters tall. Pages 1 through 6 and 11 through 14 are physically absent, gone before the codex ever reached Europe. Those missing pages describe, in precise procedural sequence, what the soul encounters after it leaves the body. What remains is already enough to overturn everything the Church has taught about death. Banned, hidden, called heretical. 3 words. 1 deliberate erasure. A Cairo antiquities dealer sold the codex to German scholar Karl Reinhardt in 1896. Reinhardt recognized immediately what he held. The manuscript moved to Berlin, sat through 2 world wars, survived Allied bombing, and was not published until 1955. 59 years between acquisition and publication. That number alone should stop you. The text did not vanish from the ancient world, though. 2 independent Greek papyrus fragments recovered from separate Egyptian sites confirm the Gospel of Mary was circulating across the Mediterranean world by the 2nd century. This was not a local curiosity. It was a widely transmitted document that someone, systematically, removed from the canonical record. What the text actually describes is not theology in the way the Church uses that word. It is a procedural map, not allegory, not metaphor. A step-by-step account of what the soul encounters, what forces challenge it, and what the soul must know to pass through. Mary Magdalene delivers this account directly, in her own voice, as transmitted testimony. In the next several minutes, you will see what Mary actually transmitted, what the 7 powers are, and what they demand of the ascending soul, and why the Church's version of final judgment is not the original teaching. It is the replacement. If suppressed biblical history is the territory you want to keep exploring, subscribe now. Every week, we go back into the archive and surface what was taken out. The primary source is Gospel of Mary, pages 7 through 8, Berlin Gnostic Codex, Papyrus Berlinensis 8502. The translation used here is Karen King's 2003 critical edition, published through Harvard Divinity School, which remains the scholarly standard for this manuscript. King worked directly from the Coptic text. What she found in those pages is not what the Church's tradition prepared anyone to expect. The operative Coptic term is hap. Modern translators have reached for the English word judgment, and that translation is technically defensible, but functionally misleading. Hap does not mean verdict. It does not mean sentence. It carries the meaning of ongoing discernment, a continuous weighing, a process that unfolds across time, rather than a single moment of divine adjudication. The difference is not subtle. It is structural. The entire architecture of Christian eschatology assumes a final tribunal, a single moment at the end of history when accounts are settled. Hap describes something categorically different, a living process, a judgment that is already underway. And according to the text, it begins the moment the soul encounters matter, not at death, not at the end of days. The Gospel of Mary places the beginning of this discernment process at the soul's first contact with the material world. The soul enters matter, and judgment, hap, continuous weighing, begins immediately. Every encounter with the physical world is part of the process. Every attachment formed, every illusion accepted, every moment of identification with the material rather than the essential. The text treats this not as punishment, but as mechanics. This is how the soul's condition is established before it ever reaches the ascent. He had no way to know. Yet the author of this text, writing in the 2nd century or drawing on traditions older still, describes a process of self-assessment that modern neuroscience has since mapped with instruments. The neuroscience of identity confirms that the self model, the brain's continuous internal representation of who and what a person is not fixed. It is revised constantly. Every experience updates it. Every loss, every attachment, Every confrontation with reality reshapes the model. There is no static self waiting to be judged at a final moment. There is only the model as it currently stands, built from every prior encounter with matter. Dr. Anil Seth, whose 2021 work on predictive processing and the constructed self brought this framework into mainstream scientific discussion, describes the self as a controlled hallucination, continuously generated, continuously updated, never final. The Gospel of Mary described this 17 centuries before Seth named it. The soul is not a fixed entity that arrives at judgment unchanged. It arrives as the accumulated product of every encounter with matter since it first touched the material world. That is what HAP measures. Not a moment, a history. The Church's end-time tribunal, the singular judgment seat, the final accounting before God after death, does not appear in Mary's text. Scholars of early Christian literature, including Elaine Pagels in her 1979 study of the Gnostic Gospels, have traced the singular final judgment framework to later doctrinal consolidation, formalized across the 3rd and 4th centuries as institutional Christianity defined its boundaries. Mary's text predates that consolidation. It predates the creeds. It predates the councils. What it describes is older than the doctrine that replaced it. The ancient claim is that judgment is a living process, already active, measurable in real time. The modern data confirms. The self is a continuous construction, never static, always being revised by contact with matter. The ancients called it HAP. Neuroscience calls it the predictive self model. Same process, different century. And this is where the map gets precise. The Gospel of Mary, lines 15 through 17 of the section scholars catalog as the Soul's Ascent passage, sits inside Papyrus Berlinensis 8502. That manuscript is held at the Ägyptisches Museum und Papyrussammlung in Berlin. Karen King's 2003 translation, published through Harvard Divinity School, remains the primary scholarly reference for the English-speaking world. And what those lines describe is not a welcome. It is an interrogation. The Coptic term used for the figures conducting that interrogation is exousia. Not angels, not guardians in any devotional sense. Exousia means jurisdictional authorities, enforcement powers. The same word appears in Roman administrative texts to describe officials with the legal right to demand identification before granting passage. The Gospel of Mary applies that exact political legal vocabulary to the afterlife. 7 of them. 7 sequential powers, each one demanding that the ascending soul name its origin before it is permitted to continue. This is not metaphor dressed in ancient language. The text is procedural. It reads like a checkpoint record. Each power poses a specific challenge. Each challenge targets a different layer of what the soul believes itself to be. And the soul that cannot answer correctly does not pass. It is returned. Now here is the detail that the Church's version of judgment never preserved. The Apocryphon of John, a separate Gnostic manuscript, housed in the Nag Hammadi Library, translated by Frederick Wiese and published in the Coptic Gnostic Library series, describes an identical 7-tier structure. Different text, different custodian, different translator, same architecture, layer by layer. 2 manuscripts, 1 framework. And they were not found together. The Apocryphon of John was buried at Nag Hammadi in Upper Egypt, discovered in 1945. Papyrus Berlinensis 8502 was acquired in Cairo in 1896, nearly 50 years earlier, through a separate transaction entirely. The scribes who produced them lived in different communities, possibly different centuries. They had no shared institutional authority coordinating their theology. Yet the 7 powers appear in both, in the same sequence, with the same function. He had no institutional framework to maintain consistency across those texts. Yet the procedure is internally consistent down to the number of tiers and the nature of each demand. That is not the signature of invented mythology. That is the signature of a transmitted record. The soul that carries gnosis, the operative knowledge, not belief, not faith, but specific functional knowledge of its own origin, answers correctly at each gate. The soul that does not carry that knowledge cannot answer. And the text is precise about what happens next. It does not say the soul is punished. It says the soul is recycled, returned into matter, sent back through the process of embodiment. The word the church chose instead was judgment leading to reward or condemnation. Final, singular, one direction or the other. What the Berlin Codex describes is a mechanism, a filtering system, with a specific pass condition and a specific failure consequence. The modern match for this is not comfortable. Researchers studying continuity of consciousness after clinical death.
Before we continue, some of what I've learned simply never makes it onto YouTube. That's why I started the Gnostic newsletter, a free newsletter where I go deeper into esoteric Gnostic teachings, hidden wisdom, and the mysteries we don't share in these videos. And when you sign up, you'll receive a Gnostic guide to mastering reality as a welcome gift, completely free. You'll find it through the link in the description below or by scanning the QR code on your screen. I'll give you a moment to do that.
Including Dr. Pim van Lommel, whose 2001 study in The Lancet documented 344 cardiac arrest patients with verified near-death experiences consistently report a structured encounter, not a random luminous event, a sequential passage with distinct stages. Some subjects report being asked questions they could not answer. Some report being turned back. Van Lommel's data is peer-reviewed, published in one of the most cited medical journals on Earth. And the structure his subjects describe, stage by stage, maps against what the Berlin Codex recorded in Coptic script somewhere between the 2nd and 4th centuries. Same sequence, different century, different language, same checkpoint architecture. And this is where the text stops being ancient history and starts being something else entirely. The passage cataloged as lines 8 through the opening of line 9 in the Soul's Ascent section of the Gospel of Mary comes from the same manuscript. The Berlin Gnostic Codex, Papyrus Berlinensis 8502. Marvin Meyer's 2004 translation, included in the Nag Hammadi Scriptures volume published by Harper One, renders this passage with a precision that most readers miss on first contact. Mary describes the soul being drawn toward luminosity. The Coptic word is uowin. It means light. But in the grammatical construction Mary's text uses, uowin is not the destination. It is the mechanism. The soul is not arriving at light. The soul is being drawn by it. The distinction in the Coptic is structural, not interpretive. Uowin functions here the way a current functions in water, not a place you reach, a force that moves you. And what waits at the end of that movement is not the pleroma. It is the first gate. The interrogation begins the moment the soul arrives at the luminosity, not after, not beyond it, at it. The light and the checkpoint are the same location. Mary's account does not describe the light as salvation. It describes the light as the threshold of the recycling mechanism. This is impossible knowledge for a 2nd century text. The concept that near-death luminosity could function as a lure rather than a destination has no precedent in any mainstream religious tradition of that era. Jewish afterlife theology, Roman mystery cult eschatology, early Christian resurrection doctrine. None of them frame the light as a trap. They frame it as the goal. Mary's text frames it as the gate. Now consider the modern data. Dr. Kenneth Ring, Professor Emeritus of Psychology at the University of Connecticut, documented structured light passage experiences across more than 280 verified near-death cases in his 1980 study published as Life at Death. Ring identified a consistent architecture, the sensation of movement toward luminosity, followed by a distinct threshold experience, followed in a significant subset of cases by what subjects described as a structured encounter or interrogation, before either continuing or being returned. 280 cases, documented, published through a university press. And the architecture Ring's subjects described in 1980 matches the architecture Mary described in a Coptic manuscript that had been sealed in a clay jar in Egypt for over 1,500 years before anyone in the modern world read it. Ring had not read the Berlin Codex. The Berlin Codex had not been fully translated into English by 1980. There was no cross-contamination. The match is structural, independent, and reproducible. The pleroma, the fullness, the true origin point of the divine spark, is not described anywhere in the Gospel of Mary as being inside the light. It is described as being beyond the entire system the light belongs to. The light is part of the architecture the demiurge constructed. The pleroma is what exists outside that architecture entirely. This is the detail that changes everything about how you read a near-death experience. The light is not the exit. The light is the last checkpoint before the recycling gate. Stay with me, because the text tells you exactly how to refuse it. The sequence that follows in the Berlin Gnostic Codex, lines 9 through the middle of line 10 in the Soul's Ascent passage, Papyrus Berlinensis 8502, is the most operationally specific section of the entire Gospel of Mary. Karen King's 2003 translation, published through Harvard University Press in the Gospel of Mary of Magdala, renders this passage as a three-stage protocol delivered directly by the Savior to Mary. Not a parable, a procedure. The Coptic word at the center of this passage is su'un. It is translated as to know. But su'un in the Coptic grammatical tradition carries a meaning that philosophical knowing does not capture. Su'un is operational. It is the knowledge of how to do something, not simply the awareness that something exists. The same root appears in Coptic medical texts to describe a practitioner who knows how to perform a procedure. It is skill knowledge, functional knowledge, a passcode, not a belief. The Savior gives Mary a precise sequence. First, silence. The soul does not speak immediately upon encountering the powers. It maintains interior stillness. Second, the name. The soul declares its true origin, the point of light it issued from before embodiment, the pre-material identity that the powers cannot fabricate or replicate. Third, the refusal. The soul explicitly declines to be bound by the jurisdiction of the exousia. It names the authority as illegitimate. It states that it does not belong to the system the powers administer. 3 steps: silence, name, refusal. Now, here is where the manuscript record becomes extraordinary. The Pistis Sophia, a separate Gnostic text housed in the British Library as Additional Manuscript 5114, translated by G.R.S. Mead in 1921 and later by Violet McDermott in the Coptic Gnostic Library series, contains in its first book an account of the soul's passage through the archon layers that describes the same 3-stage protocol. Different manuscript, different custodian, different translator, different century of composition, silence, declaration of origin, refusal of jurisdiction. The procedure is internally consistent across texts that were never stored together, never administered by the same community, and never coordinated by any institution that survived into the historical record. The Pistis Sophia was copied in a different scribal tradition than Papyrus Berlinensis 8502. The two documents arrived in European scholarly hands through entirely separate acquisition chains. He had no institutional framework to maintain that consistency. Yet the 3-step protocol appears in both, in the same order, with the same functional logic. That is not theological coincidence. That is transmission of a specific technical record. The modern match arrives from an unexpected direction. Dr. Stanislav Grof, whose research into non-ordinary states of consciousness spans more than 50 years of clinical documentation, published findings in 1985 through SUNY Press in Beyond the Brain, describing subjects who, during structured sessions, encountered what they described as gate-like authorities demanding identification. A subset of those subjects reported that the encounter resolved only when they ceased engaging with the authorities' demands, and instead stated a prior identity that the authority had no framework to process. Silence. Origin. Refusal. Groff's subjects had not read the Gospel of Mary. Most had not read any Gnostic text. They arrived at the same three-stage resolution through direct experience, documented in a clinical setting, published through an academic press in 1985. The pages of the Gospel of Mary that are missing, the opening sections, lost before the manuscript was acquired in 1896, never recovered despite decades of search, are the pages that preceded this protocol. What they once contained, what instructions or context the Savior gave before the silence, name, refusal sequence, is a question no living scholar can answer. What the missing pages once contained is the question that has never been answered. Papyrus Berlinensis 8502 is catalogued and physically held in Berlin today. Papyrus Oxyrhynchus L3525 sits in the Ashmolean. Papyrus Rylands 463 is in Manchester. All three independently verifiable. The seven-power architecture appears without alteration across four separate Gnostic manuscripts. Same sequence, same interrogation logic, same demand for the soul's response. That consistency is not interpretation. It is a documented pattern. And pages 1 through 6, 11 through 14, their absence is itself a catalogued fact. Whatever stood before the silence name refusal protocol remains unanswered. The mechanism described in what survives is still there, in the record, unchanged, still running. If this evidence changes how you understand what the soul faces, leave that below. We surface what was removed from the record every week.